All right, and welcome back to this part. So this one's going to be a little bit more monotonous because we're going to work through kind of the process we've established to make some pretty basic materials for a lot of the smaller parts of our mesh here. So one material that we're going to use a lot over this mesh is our steel material, just like a general metal, general steel. And so a lot of the areas that we're going to be using it on aren't very big. They don't take up a lot of real estate on our mesh. And so we're not going to make them overly detailed because really that's just going to be detail that gets lost on our model. So it's going to be a pretty simple one. I'm going to bring all these guys back here. And to go ahead and create this material, I want to go up to our package here. Just right click and hit new and substance graph. And again, remember, we actually created a template, which is going to help us do all the setup here. Megaphone template. Going to call this steel, and I'm going to hit OK. All right, and this is going to create our steel graph here. So I'm going to come back into our megaphone, drag the steel in. You can see that, because we've set up all the hookups, we're going to have all those there. So I'm just going to drag everything through there and then drag through the output. So nothing should change because we haven't actually set anything up. And if I just come back to our standard, I'm going to want to plug our ID map here into our ID map socket. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to want to open in context. And so now we're going to be able to see all of our inputs in our nodes here. And I'm going to first try and figure out what area we want to select in our ID map here. So I'm going to just plug this into our output. And I'm going to right click and compute nodes. All right, that didn't seem to work. Right click and view outputs in 3D. There we go. So we can see that the areas that I want to be this nice steel color are going to be this kind of almost like turquoise, greeny blue color. So on our color to mask here, just double click that guy and single click this guy. Going to get the eyedropper, and I'm going to try and find that turquoisey color. So I'm going to plug this back in. So now let's just take a look and see if our mask actually got all of those guys. Yeah, there we go. So you can see what we've pretty much masked off. We've masked off some interiors of our panel, right? The rim there, some bolts. We've also got, if I come back out here, bring the lighting around, right? We've got some bolts in here, just some smaller metalwork that we're going to want to get up and running first so that as we get texturing the bigger bulk of our mesh, we can see how it's going to look in context with our kind of smaller accessories. Perfect. So I'm going to bring this back. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and start playing around with our base color here. So I'm going to bring this up. And I'm just going to bring this down a little bit because I'm going to want to blend in some new colors to this texture set. So I'm going to do blend. And the way that I'm going to blend in some colors is kind of been what we've been doing in the past, where we use our mask to mask off those areas, and then we introduce just another uniform color into the mix. So I'm going to drag our mask over here and plug that guy into our opacity of our blend. And so now instead of dragging in a uniform color and trying to figure out what the appropriate color value for our metal will be, there actually is a node that has a couple of preset metal reflectance values that is going to just make that kind of guessing game obsolete and just help us get the actual look of the metal scientifically that we want. And so that node is called the, if we take a look here, the PBR metal reflectance node. And so if we input that, you can see all it is just a 2K pretty much uniform color node. But if we come over to the metal color, we get a drop down of a bunch of different metals. And you can see that as we scroll through, it's just going to give us different color values for our metal reflectance value. And so even though we've called this this graph steel, maybe a bit of a misnomer, unfortunately, because there actually isn't a steel drop down, but we're going to choose iron here. So I'm going to just take that guy, drag him in, and you can see now we're going to get all of those color values showing up. So that's perfect. So that's pretty much all I want to do right now with our base color, just to get the color rolling so we can start seeing something show up on our mesh. So if I come back out, I'm just going to leave our normal for right now because, again, we don't really have any new normals that we want to introduce to this material quite yet. So I just want to use the baked normal map that we have for our material. So if I come down to roughness here, again, I might want to play around with just changing the roughness of this particular material. And you can see that right now what we have it as just being kind of this dark gray. So if we try and catch the light a little bit, you can see that it's pretty glossy, but I want to have direct control over that and be able to play with that on the fly. So again, I'm just going to drag this down, give us some room to work with here, and add a blend node. And using this color to mask here, I'm just going to click and drag that in so that now we've only masked off our steel or iron areas. And you know what? Instead of just calling this steel, let's come up and right click on this graph, go to rename, and I'm going to rename that iron. And we're going to get this affected paths show up. And this is, again, just a good understanding as to why, you know, the difference between linking and importing as well for our resources is when you change file paths, any dependencies that that package has might break the structure of it. So select where the OID should be changed, package, hit OK, and we should be good there. And we just take a look, base color, all of our outputs and inputs. Everything looks okay. Cool. So now that we've changed that, I want to go ahead and actually provide a color value or a grayscale value that we can play around with just for the, if we take a look here, there we go, just for the reflectivity of our steel or our iron here. Just changed the name to iron and I already forgot what it was. So let's go ahead and drag in a uniform color here. And drag this up a little bit more. And the first thing I want to do is you can see that we've got a color output socket and we've got a grayscale chain here. So we're going to need to change this uniform color to grayscale down in its parameters. So now that's going to just change that guy right there. So we can plug that in. And you can see, actually, there was a better view up here. Right now, we've just got a solid black glossiness or roughness. So it's going to be very glossy, very shiny. But as we increase the value of that, you can see it's going to become very rough. And pure white is going to make it just basically entirely rough. So we're not going to get any highlights or any clear defined reflections because it's just so bloody rough. And that's not really what we want, especially for a metal, right? Where it's going to be a bit of a polished metal. So this is going to give us full control over just kind of the reflectivity of our metal. So I don't want it to be pure black, but I'm going to bring it off of pure black to maybe let's do 0.1. So again, it's pretty, if we can get a grazing angle here, you can see it's pretty glossy, but it's not entirely like a mirror where it's 100% reflective. All right, and so we're going to leave that for now. And I'm going to come down to our metallic. And so now this is where we're going to really notice the biggest change, I think, is in our metallic map. So I bring this guy down and add a blend there. So what we're going to do for this is we're going to also use, again, our color to mask mask here that we've got from our ID map. But instead of plugging this guy into our opacity of our blend and then using a uniform color node to basically indicate if this is not non-metal or metal, I'm going to take this instead and plug it into the foreground of our blend. And you can see because we have right now no metal value coming in, all the metal values are just going to be on our iron layer right here. And so that looks okay right now. We don't really notice any glaring issues, but we're actually going to have to change the blending mode, because what we've essentially done is, if we take a look at our ambient occlusion down here, and if I just plug this guy in to our metallic, you can see that we still get only the foreground layer showing up, because we actually have a copy blend mode on, which basically means it's only going to take what's in the top layer and display that. And if we don't present a mask to the opacity of this blend, it's only going to show whatever is on the top layer. So if we want to keep the white values and remove any of the darker values from our top layer, the blending mode for that is going to be screen. So if I come down to screen, you can see now, right? It's going to be a little bit hard to tell in our ambient occlusion, but we've kept all of the white values from our top layer and gotten rid of the black values, because as we continue along the chain of our material, we're going to want to obviously keep the areas that we're indicating as metal or not, but we also want to continuously be able to add different areas that are metal and get rid of the areas that are not metal, because if we take a look back to our metallic input, if you remember back from a video or two ago where we input our metallic value as black, this means that anything that we don't explicitly declare as a metal in any of these material graphs that we make is just going to be denoted as black. So we've kind of given ourselves a safeguard where if we don't explicitly say, hey, this is metal, it will automatically assume that it's not metal. So I'm going to plug this back in, this black value. And so now, making sure that we have a screen blending mode on, we're going to be able to get our metals to show up. And this will probably make a little bit more sense as we continue along making the next three materials that we're going to make. And one last tidbit is the reason that I decided to, instead of plugging this into the opacity and plug this into the foreground, is it's just going to be one less image texture that we're going to have to load whenever we're manipulating this material and stuff. And so if we can get the same effect with less nodes, that is likely the better route to take. It's just more efficient that way. I'm going to bring this down. And so much like our normal up over here, we don't really have much of a use right now for our ambient occlusion output. So let's just make one. Because if we look at our iron over here, and actually I'm going to play around with the roughness again. Maybe something like 0.17. It's a little bit too uniform, right? And if I come down to this panel over here, and maybe even just drag another environment map into our parameters here. Let's try this one right here. Yeah, there we go. Maybe 0.15, just a little bit shinier. You can see it's pretty uniform, and it's a little bit boring, really. It's fine to say that. It's kind of boring. So I want to go and add maybe a little bit more information, right? Again, nothing too detailed, but something that, especially on the larger areas like this face right here, something that we're going to be able to see and go, okay, it looks kind of true to life, right? And so something that pretty much every surface in our real world has is edge wear, right? Scratches and the like. So I'm going to go ahead and add some scratches to our, I keep wanting to say steel, our iron material here. And this is going to utilize both our normal and ambient occlusion. And we might also be able to kind of use it in our roughness a little bit as well. So to go about starting our scratches, I'm going to search for our scratches generator. And you can see if we come in here, we're going to just have a lot of randomized and procedural scratches. And we're going to have a ton of parameters to play around with these. But the first thing I want to do is I want to get these hooked up just so that we can start visualizing them on our material. And then we'll go around and play with the parameters to see what fits. So if I can just come in here. And I'm going to start with our ambient occlusion. Actually, you know what? I take that back. We're going to start with our normal because that's probably the easiest to see what's going on. If I bring this up, bring this down. And the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to want to combine these normals, right? Because we're going to want to create a normal from this guy here, making sure that we set it to force alpha to 1 just so I can see what's going on. And for this particular material that we're working with, because our baked map is DirectX, we just want to make sure that this is also DirectX. And you can see right now that we've got this normal information. So if I come up to normal combine, and I bring this into the top there, you can see that we're going to get our normal information, but one immediate problem, besides, it's all over our material here, is that it actually looks like it's bumping out towards the camera, the viewer. So instead of being scratches indenting in, it actually looks like it's coming out towards us. And so the reason for that is because we're drawing our normal map from a grayscale here. And the way that it draws that information is that anything that is lighter value is more like a bump, whereas anything that is a darker value is more of a recess. So we can go about doing this in two ways, and I'll just kind of show them quickly here. The first way we can do this is just add an invert grayscale node or a levels node, and then we just invert our color selection here so that now we've got the black and the white. So now it looks more like it's actually indented in our material. However, that is just another node that we don't need. And remember, if we can get the same result with fewer nodes, let's choose that route. So in our normal here, you might not know, but we can actually, if we just bring this guy down, you can see that we can only go to 0. But if you actually type in the value, we can go much below 0. And if I go -1, you can see now what it's done. If I just Control Z, this is our original value, and Control Y, now negative, we've just inverted our normal map. And so that's a pretty common trick that I use a lot of the time. If my normals don't show up right, and I know that they need to be inverted because they're operating off of a grayscale or height information, I'll just take my normal node and just create a negative value for my intensity. And so now, if we want to have a little bit less intensity, we have to go up, right? Still staying in the negatives, but taking our value closer to 0. And maybe something like -0.05, just for very, smaller, subtle scratches. So that's looking pretty cool. So if I drag this guy back, I want to fit these guys into our frame here. Perfect. And so now the last thing that I need to do is I need to be able to mask off where these scratches affect, right? Because right now we're going to be getting these scratches showing up all over our material. And so while eventually I'm going to want to add scratches all over our material, I want to make sure that each material has its own type of scratches, because I want to be able to manipulate a scratch modifier or a scratch generator to fit the area of the mesh without getting some, funky results somewhere else on our mesh, because it doesn't really fit the need of that particular part. And so in order to do that, we're going to do the same process that we've done before. I'm just going to get a blend node. I'm going to make sure that we are masking off, again, the areas that we want. I just fill that there, frame that. Take this guy and plug him into the blend. And again, remembering the logic here, where anything that's in the top layer of our blend node is going to be what shows up in the areas that we have masked off. And anything that's in the background layer is going to be what the rest of the material is going to basically be using. So with that in mind, I want to make sure that the steel is using our normal combined. So I'm going to just plug this into the top. And I want to make sure that whatever we haven't masked off is going to be using the continuous normal map that we continue to build or add to. So that's going to be our normal input here. So I'm going to plug that into our background. So you can see now that our material is still using the same normal map that we've been working off of, but we're going to have scratches on all of the areas that are iron. We take a look up here, see if we can see any scratches. Oh, can kind of see one right there. So now I want to go ahead and just start playing around with the scratches, because I think they're a little bit too large. So I'm going to double click this guy here. Maybe bring this down just a little bit so we can see. And with our scratches generator, again, we can play around with the number, make it more sparse, make it more dense. We can play around with the rotations. And again, this is all random and procedural. Play around with the randomness, the spline scale, make them smaller, make them much longer. So I want to make mine a little bit smaller. Maybe decrease the number, bring the scale up just a little bit. Just to get a little bit of wear and tear. And so there's a whole bunch of different parameters that we're going to be able to play with to get our scratches looking pretty good. And maybe a little bit too sparse again. Maybe I'll bring the number back up. And we can also play around with the random seed. And this is just going to give us different variations. And maybe a good starting basis for where we want our scratches to kind of go. And so that's looking pretty cool. I might just decrease the intensity to something like -0.025. Again, something that's just kind of light, because I don't want a ton of scratches all over this, but I want just enough to add a little bit of variety or intrigue to it. So now that we've got that, I want to go ahead and start using this to fuel our ambient occlusion a little bit, right? Because this is a little bit of an indentation into our mesh, theoretically. And so with that will come a little bit of light occlusion. Now we're going to have to be careful, because we don't want it to be too much, because these really aren't hugely occluded areas, but they might contribute to a little bit of light occlusion on their own. So what I'm going to do is just drag and drop that guy out, and I'm going to add a blend node, and I want to add this to my ambient occlusion. So I'm just going to make sure that this guy is in the top, and I'm going to want to plug our ambient occlusion into the background there. So remember what an ambient occlusion map does, right? The darker values provide shadow information, and pure white basically means that there is no occlusion whatsoever. So how are we going to be able to draw that information from our scratches here, right? Because our scratches are going to be the areas where shadows form. So the blending operation that we're going to want to use between these two is going to be subtract. And subtract is going to take our top value, find the areas that are lighter, and remove it from the areas that are lighter down in our second texture here, so that we get something kind of like that. And so this is going to allow us to get a bunch of shadow information for all of the scratches that we have across our material. And again, we're just going to want to make sure that we are using our mask to mask off the areas that is happening. Perfect. So if I can find an area here, perfect. Let's take a look over here. And we plug this guy into our output here. You can see that now we're going to get all that shadow information popping up. However, the problem is that that is very, very harsh. So we just want to come into our blend and we want to really bring down the opacity on that. Maybe even to something like 0.1, just something very small. And again, this is kind of a one of those negligible aspects of your material. If you don't really want to contribute more to your ambient occlusion, I wouldn't say this is an area that is a must. But again, it is just something that you can play around with just to see how it looks and it operates. And so now if we play around with the intensity, you can again just see more shadow, less shadow. And this will allow you to fine tune the light occlusion of your material here. So I'm going to do something like maybe 0.15, just something really, even that's a little too dark. 0.10. And I'm thinking maybe something like that. And so the next material that we're going to make is just for a smaller little piece over here that I kind of felt was a better, nice little accent piece is this guy right here, right? Because we have some of our iron showing up on top of this piece. And again, much like our iron, even though it is a bit of an accent piece, it's relatively small on our mesh here. And so it's not going to be the most detailed piece in our entire thing here. So with this material, I'm not going to spend a lot of time covering, a lot of the basics now, because we really are just doing the same exact process that we've been doing for the past couple materials. And kind of here on out, we're going to be moving through these materials a little bit faster with maybe a little bit less explanation. That being said, if we do reach an area that maybe is a little different that we haven't done yet, I will spend the time to cover what exactly it is we're doing. So just like we've done before, I want to come up to our graph and do a new substance graph, making sure our template is selected. And I'm going to call this gold. And again, it's going to bring everything in there, create our template for us. So if I come back and I just drag our gold into our graph here so that we're going to be able to take a look at it. And I'm just going to select everything. And there I just hit 2 on my keyboard. Remember our selection 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard on the top row there. And bring that guy in. And I'm going to want to plug in our ID map. Beauty. So now right click and opening this guy in context, we're going to be able to see all of our inputs. And so I'm going to want to, first of all, figure out what exactly our color is going to be for this guy. So if I just view this in output, we can see that this guy is going to be that a pretty bright green. And if I take a look down here, we can see right down there, that's going to be our guy. So I'm coming into our mask and just selecting that green, take a look and see if they line up. And just to take a look and see if that is indeed our guy. Perfect. So now that we've got that all set up, I'm going to start by adding a color to this. And it's going to be basically the same thing we did for the iron. Is I'm just going to add a blend. I'm going to use the color to mask this off. And I'm going to use our PBR meta reflectance. And so one of the values in there, which is actually by default, is gold. And so I'm just going to use that guy there, plug that in, and we're going to get our gold value to show up. And so one thing I realized I didn't do actually in our iron material is I didn't change the size of these nodes. So quickly I'm going to change this to absolute, bring this down to 16 by 16 again. And again, just in order to make sure that we have as efficient a node setup as possible, we want to decrease the number of nodes and we want to decrease the size of them when at all possible. So if you missed that step in the last material like I did, feel free to pause this video, go back, and switch those up again as well. Perfect. So we've got this guy set up. I'm going to skip the normals for now because I don't have any normal information I want to start with. Going to again play around with our roughness here. So setting up our quick value blend where we just blend it in, add a mask to this guy, adding our uniform color, making sure it's grayscale. I just bring these. I have a little bit of OCD. I want to make sure that these are all kind of lined up into our graph as much as possible. Making sure to set this as well to our 16 by 16 pixels. And then bringing this in so that we have full control. Take a look down here with our roughness. Again, I'm going to do something like maybe 0.18. Perfect. Bring our ambient occlusion and metallic down. I'm going to do the same exact thing that we did in our previous material here, where I just add a blend. And so this is where we're going to be able to see really what I was talking about with regards to using the screen blend mode for our material. Because if I bring this guy in over top, right, you can see that we're going to have this show up as metal because we've plugged our mask into this. But now our iron areas, I almost said steel, caught myself. Our iron areas aren't going to be metallic anymore. And so even though we have them coming in, what we've done is we've just taken this guy here, went blop, plugged him over top. So now that's the only output. But if we change our blending mode to screen, now we're going to be able to have both our iron and our gold areas showing up together. And like I said before, because our initial, if we come back here, our initial input into our metallic stream here is a black color. Anything that isn't declared a metal is going to show up as non-metal. And so now we are able to get all of our metals showing up, and that's looking pretty cool. And that's all I really want to do right now for this little accent piece. Again, it's pretty prominent or, a bit of an eye catcher, but mostly just because of its roughness and albedo values. And again, any detail that we're going to really get into on that particular material is going to be a little bit wasted when we're viewing the asset from this far away. Awesome. And so now in this next material we're going to make, it's going to be the button right down here. And again, this is going to be just kind of another accent piece that we're going to be able to play around with, maybe have a little bit of fun. And we're also going to now take a look at exposing some parameters that we're going to be able to use to play with the button from outside of its subgraph in our parent graph here. And so we'll take a look at what that means and then maybe go back and expose some parameters for these guys as well. So just like we've done before, I'm going to come up and do a new graph, get our template, and I'm going to call this guy button. Or you know what? Let's call it trigger instead. A little bit more specific. Beautiful. So I'm going to come into our megaphone here, bring our trigger graph into here. Just going to plug everything in. And I want to make sure that I take this guy here and plug that into our ID map. So now if I edit in context here. And I'm just going to view our outputs in 3D here. I want to go ahead and just start developing, again, the characteristics of our material. Actually, I should zoom back in. I don't know why I zoomed out. Get some nice light in there. All right, and bring this guy down. And just using the same methods that we've done before, going to blend in some color values. And before we get ahead of ourselves, I'm going to plug this guy into our output just to see what color we've got here. So that's a nice orange color. So that's these guys down here. So if I just quickly snag those there, take a look and see if that's exactly what we want. Perfect. And so now I'm going to go ahead and blend this in. Use our mask to mask off the opacity of that. Bring our uniform color in. Plug them in there. And again, making sure that we're efficient. So I want to just decrease the size of this solid color. And so now we can go ahead and we can play around with the color value for this guy. So I'm going to want something that's a little bit of a darker red, really. Maybe change the saturation a little bit more. Something that's just kind of like a deep red. And that's pretty good. I like that. Again, we can skip our normal because we're not really adding any new normals to this. I want it to be nice and smooth. I do want to have control over the roughness. And again, this will be another parameter that we're going to expose so that we can get all of this information outside of having to come in and edit within context. Nothing really different here, though. We're just going to blend these together. Bring this guy over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this uniform so that I don't have to go and set up all of the output sizes. And I'm just going to select grayscale and plug that guy in over top. And boom, again, we've got our control for this this trigger material, and we can make it a little bit glossier or a little bit more rough or rougher. And actually, I kind of like that nice smooth plastic look to it. And again, we don't really have to touch our metallic because this isn't going to be a metallic piece here. So I'm just going to let our metallic pass through. And I'm also going to let our ambient occlusion pass through because we don't have any information that we really want to add to this guy here. So we've got a pretty basic setup here, but we've got some things that I want to be able to expose to play around with in our megaphone graph here. So I'm not having to go into the graph every time that I want to edit things. So we're going to go and take a look at the rest of these three materials here as well, and just see some quick things that are pretty common parameters that we want to be able to play around with without having to go back in to the graph and find where these various elements are to play around and give them a good look that we want. So the first one for this particular graph is going to be our base color here. And so I'm going to click on this guy. And I'm going to come down, and we've already exposed parameters before. And I'm just going to click on them and hit expose. And we're okay to leave the input name as our output color there. And I'm going to hit OK. And you can see now that we've had that disappear. But if I double click in our graph area and come down to our input parameters, you can see that we've got all of this popping up down here. And this is going to be one of the parameters that we're going to be able to explore in our parent graph. So for the label, this is just going to be what the label or the name of this parameter is in our parent graph. So I'm just going to call this trigger color. So now this will be called the trigger color in our parent graph. We can also give a group for this guy just to help organize it a little bit. So this is non-essential, but I'm going to just do it, to get one of those little drop down menus there. And I'm going to call this color. We can also change the default value to something, whatever we want really, but I like it on the value that we have right now. And it looks like after I Control Z, it actually removed everything. So I'm just going to quickly rename this and put this back into the color one. Perfect. So now you can see that this is our color group, and this is going to be the name of our label. So if I come back up to Megaphone here, and I just single click on this graph, we're going to have our color group and our trigger color value. So I'm going to come back into our trigger because there's one more parameter that I want to change, and that is the roughness. So I'm going to come down and again, just expose this parameter. And instead of output color 1, I'm just going to go new, and I'm going to call it rough. I'll hit OK. And again, double clicking in our graph to come down to our input parameters, you can see that we have our color and our rough. So I'm going to call this roughness. And I'm not going to put this one actually in a group, and we're just going to see what that looks like. So if I come back up to our parent graph and click on our trigger instance here, you can see that our color for our trigger is in a group, but our roughness is not. And so that's just going to be the difference. It's going to be some organizational stuff. But if you don't put your parameters into groups, you're just going to have them all show up readily available without any kind of categorization. So depending on your situation, that might be preferred or not. So now that I'm happy with all the parameters in here, I'm going to just right click this guy and clear that breadcrumb so that we're no longer editing this graph within context. And I'm going to quickly come back to our gold. And I want to just make sure that I can expose the roughness on this guy. So output color is fine. And again, these input names are all just unique to the graph. So output color is going to be fine because we don't have another parameter in this particular graph that we have declared as output color. And again, I want to come down to the parameters. Just change this to roughness. Alrighty, and we can clear that one there. Just making sure that we've got this here. Come into our iron. Again, we can play around with the normal intensity. We can call that intensity. Hit OK. We can export some of the parameters within our scratches generator, and I'm going to leave that up to you because that can cascade into a whole web of different possibilities of which we want to actually export certain parameters over others. But the option is there, and you can see that we have that option for pretty much every single parameter in our scratches generator here. I'm also going to come down to our roughness and expose that as well. And I'm going to call this output color, again, because intensity was our normal map. So we want to do output color. And that's looking pretty good. So I just want to come into our input parameters here. And I'm going to drag this guy up because this is our roughness. And I just want to keep consistent ordering with our other nodes there. So I'm going to call that roughness. And I'm going to call this normal intensity. And if I clear that guy there and click on our iron, you can see that we've got our roughness and our normal intensity. And so the last material we're going to make for this particular video is going to be the material that comprises our little panel here. And so this one's going to be a little bit of a two-parter where we're going to go ahead and create kind of the rubber or plastic area of the back plate here. And then we're going to try and figure out a way that we can isolate these little areas to make them their own independent material within this particular graph. So let's take a look at how we're going to do that. Just by going ahead and creating a new graph, again, our template, and I'm going to call this panel. And then immediately coming back out, so we are able to grab all of these inputs here. And just grabbing our ID map there. So now if we come down and open that in context, and I'm just going to view our outputs in 3D here. We're first, like all of our other materials, going to need to find the values for this. And so this one's going to be a little bit easier. We're not going to need to have to look for it on our material because you can kind of see that, this one looks oddly familiar, right? So just on our color to mask here, I'm going to drag that guy in. And that's going to allow us to, again, mask this area off here. So now the first thing I want to do, like all of our materials so far, is just start with our base color. And this is going to help us then kind of visualize where we're working towards and help us see what the look of this material is on our mesh in contrast to the rest of our materials. So I'm going to bring these guys down, add a blend node, and then bring this in. And taking a uniform color node here, making sure that this guy is absolute 16 by 16 pixels, and then dragging that in. And now we're going to see that our black value has been added to our material, and that's nothing new. However, I'm going to go and just make it more of an off gray. Again, I don't want it to make it pure black. That might be a little bit too light. Something that's a little bit off. It's like an off-brand black, you know. And you can see with our mask right now, we've selected the back panel, but we don't have any of these guys here. And so instead of using our mask for this, I want to go ahead and develop a little bit of a node network here using a bunch of different primitive shapes just to get a different perspective on alternative ways that we can set up masks for our material here. So with that, what I'm going to do is come back here and add a shape node, and I'm going to make this a disk. And so the disk is going to just give us this circle, and oh, look at that, how convenient that all of these guys here are also circles. And we're going to use this shape to be the basis of our mask for these particular buttons here, so that we only have to use one size parameter down here, one scale parameter, and it's going to affect all our buttons. So I'm going to change this to something like, let's do 0.6, just so that we have a little bit more black space around it. And so now I want to go ahead and I'm going to use another blend node. And I'm going to make a new color. And this is going to help us just visualize what is happening. So I'm going to make this kind of like a red, a little bit darker red. And again, the red color is not going to stay. It's just going to help us see what we're doing here. And so I'm going to plug this circle into our material. And so right now what it's going to do obviously is just plop it right in the center of our texture set here. And that's not what we want. But we have a node that's going to allow us to actually manipulate and transform this circle to help us fit the need that we have for filling in these particular buttons. So what I'm going to do with this shape node is I'm going to add a transformation 2D. And you can see that this is going to allow us to scale and move this guy around. But the problem is right? We're going to get some tiling going on, and we don't want tiling. So to get rid of that, just with our transformation node selected, we can come up to tiling mode, hit absolute, and no tiling. And now you can see that no tiling is going to occur. Perfect. So I want to make sure that I have this guy in view so that I can see where we're going to have to actually place these buttons. And then I'm going to select our transformation 2D here. And while clicking on the top right corner, I'm going to hold shift so that it locks the aspect ratio of my transformation here. So then I can just click and drag this guy up over top here. And you can see now I have the ability to move this primitive around my shape. And we can actually use this to create a unique mask by hand to fit our needs here. So I'm going to just find my handle there. And I'm going to bring this guy down even smaller. And I'm just going to line it up with our mesh here. And again, making this guy smaller. And that might be a little bit too small. So this one's just going to be a little bit of a finessing game here. You can also just play around with these handles as well. All right, so that's looking pretty good for my one button there. So now what I want to do is I want to be able to duplicate this and then just place it all over my other buttons there. So I'm going to just Control D this guy, and I'm going to blend these two together. Oopsie, not that one there. I want to blend these two together. Plug this guy into this, and I'm just going to shift and steal that, and it will automatically hook it back up. So now you can see that when I play around with this bottom one here, and if I just come back to our view here, and I play around with this bottom guy here, you can see, oh, nothing's going to happen, right? And again, that's because our blending mode. We need to go in and change our blending mode down to screen because we want to get rid of all the black and keep the white. And so now that's going to pop up. So if we just play around with this guy a little bit, just move him over there. That's looking pretty good. And we're going to do this one more time. So I'm going to add a blend onto there. Make sure to do screen. And I'm just going to control and duplicate that guy there. Plug him in. Coming back and getting our color view here. Now I can go down and bring this guy over here. And so that's looking pretty good. So I'm going to come over and I'm going to do this little button here, and we're not going to worry about this guy right now. That's because in a future video, we're actually going to be adding a little light decal or decal, however you want to pronounce it, on top of our mesh here that we create hand scratch in Substance Designer. That's going to just help accentuate this panel again. So we're going to actually overlay that on top of this little button here. So we don't even need to worry about texturing it because we won't be able to see it. So I'm going to just add our final blend. Make sure to do screen and duplicate this one more time. So you can see this is a little bit tedious and why you won't want to do this for all of your materials, hence why we use an ID map, but it does have its uses in certain instances. If I come back and take a look at this guy here, start bringing this guy over. And so now I'm going to have to really bring this guy down, scrunch him in. I don't want to rotate them. Where are we here? Perfect. So now that we've got our buttons lined up, you can also see that because I've altered the scale and because we've only drawn basically from one resource, I can now change the scale of this circle and it can basically affect all of the instances of this particular circle. And so that's powerful if we want to set something up one time and then only have one area control particular parameters of those instances. So that's really handy. Again, in this particular scenario, we're probably not going to need that, but I just wanted to show it as a viable alternative to the methods that we've been employing in this series so far. So I'm going to quickly just frame this here, and I'm going to call this button mask, and I'm going to drag this guy over here. So now that we've got our base color figured out, I want to go ahead and start playing around with some normals. Because right now this is looking kind of flat and kind of boring. Oh, before I do that, I should probably change this color to something a little bit different. And actually, I'm going to get rid of this uniform color. And again, take a look at our PBR metal reflectance. Making sure to bring this down to 14 by 14. And I'll probably do something like, we'll do silver for now. If I don't like it, we can change it. So now we're going to come down to our normal. Bring this down. Maybe bring this out a little bit. And so what I want to do for this is I actually want to take the normal of our back panel here, and I want to kind of puff it out a little bit, make it a little bit softer, and make it look as though these buttons here are actually impressed into this kind of rubber or leather plasticky kind of material. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to need to use our mask that we have here, and I'm going to need to figure out a way to try and get these dark areas to almost have like a gradient coming out from them. And one node that's really good for doing that, if I just drag and drop this out here, is the bevel node. And so you can see right now, right, we're getting our very binary mask and pushing a gradient out towards the contrasting color values here, right, our black and our white. So as I peel that back, you can see that I'm essentially decreasing the intensity. And now we can start to see these little circles here. And so a positive value will essentially take the bulk of your body here and push it outwards. But if we go into a negative value, you can see that it kind of starts to eat away from the inside here. If I take a look here, right? So this is at 0, very binary. And whereas negative is pushing outwards, sorry, as positive is pushing outwards, negative is kind of eating inwards towards itself. It's kind of like auto cannibalism in a certain way. It's a little bit morbid. You probably weren't expecting that in a substance designer tutorial, but hey, that's life for you. So I'm going to do a value of about negative 0.02. And I found that that is kind of a good area to start with. So let's just take a look and see what this normal looks like. So the nice thing about this bevel node is it actually has a normal parameter built into it. So we don't even need to add a normal node on top of this. So I'm going to do normal combine, click and drag our normal into this. And you can see now that's kind of the gist of what we wanted to do, right? We've got our buttons, and it looks like we've got them kind of impressed into our geometry here, but it's a little bit too harsh, and it's not really, it doesn't look soft. It looks like they've just been like slapped right into it. So in our bevel here, I'm going to first decrease the normal intensity parameter down here to something like 5, just to make it not as harsh. And we also have this smoothing option. And you can see that as I bring this up, it just kind of blurs pretty much everything to make it just a more soft and gradial, a more gradual transition here. And so I like a value of 5. I feel that that pretty much conveys the entire look that I was going for here. It's got that kind of soft, plushy look, right? Like you could press it and it would have a little bit of give, and that looks pretty cool. And while we've got our colors and everything lining up kind of with the areas that, um, realistically looks like it's been indented, you can see that because of the resolution of our ID map here, it's going to look a little cruddy. It looks a little jaggedy and all that. And, even though you're going to be seeing these from far away, you want to try and have as nice resolution as you can. So in our color to mask here, one option that I'm going to do is just use the mask range to kind of smooth things out just a little bit. And the other is going to be on our normal combine. And I'm just going to go to detail oriented. And that's going to help just smooth out a lot of these issues that we're having visually. And immediately that's already going to pretty much solve a lot of them. But with only one node, realistically, we're able to go from having a pretty flat background here to having something that looks very, very smooth and very soft. And really, it allows us to just almost fake an area of our mesh without even having to use any more geometry, which is really, really cool. That's something that I really like about our texture capabilities. So now that we've got our normals all taken care of there, I'm going to come down and now I'm going to take a look at our roughness. We just move these down. Again, because we've created essentially two separate masks here, because we want to have two different types of materials in this graph. So we're just going to have to go ahead and create two individual blends here. We just drag these guys down, and I'm going to do this blend here and this blend here. And so in the first blend, I want to mask this off by using our ID map. And the second mask, I'm going to use our created mask here. So now that's masked off entirely our little area here, our panel, but we need to now start adding values to it, right? Because it's really super glossy. So I'm just going to come in, make sure it's set to grayscale. We want to set the parent size down to an absolute 16 by 16. And I'm just going to duplicate that guy. So this one going into our panel here, we take a look. It's a little hard to tell here, but if we see some of the specularity there and start to rough this up, we still get that shininess. Oh, there we go, of our buttons. So I'm going to want to have something. Let's take a look. What's a good one? Maybe something like 0.15. Still a little glossy, but a little bit rough as well. And I want to now plug this guy into our buttons here so you can see what's going on. Right, and we can play around with the roughness of this. And I might do something like 0.1 because these I'm going to make just pure metal. And we're going to see what that looks like here in a second, because our next output is our metallic. I just bring this guy up and down. The only metallic part of our panel material here that we have access to is going to be these buttons here. So I'm going to add another blend. And just like we've done in the past with our metallic, I'm going to use our mask to essentially screen over top of the input metallic that we have going for us. And we're going to just be able to use that to indicate this part is metal. And again, we want to make sure that we're getting all of the rest of our metallic pieces here. So in order to do that, we just have to use screen. And so now we've got our metallic buttons impressed into our kind of almost like vinyl or linoleum. I don't even know at this point. I'm just giving material names. It's been like 6 materials at this point. But I maybe want to bring this up just a little bit, something like 0.2. And that's starting to look pretty cool. So now we can also play around with the roughness of these buttons. Maybe something like 0.15. And maybe silver's a little bit too bright. So if I come back up to our reflectance here, maybe do aluminum, no. Let's see, platinum. Yeah, platinum's a little bit darker, so I like that. Awesome, so that's looking pretty cool. So now that we've completed this final material, I just want to go ahead and expose some of the parameters that we are going to want to kind of play around with and fine tune in our parent graph as we continue our material. And the first one of those being our metal color here. To expose this, it's the same as we've always been doing. We can just come down to our little drop-down panel. We can leave that as metal colors. And so now if we come and take a look over top here in our graph here, we can see that we've got our metal colors and our label's already set up for us, metal color. And you can see that we get a whole bunch of different drop downs here. And that's because our type and editor is an integer 1, and you can see that we have a drop down list. So that's pretty cool. And what this little checkbox beside each one of these means is just the default value for this material here. So you can see, right, if I switch that to copper or to gold, we're going to have those as our default value. So that's pretty cool. I'm going to leave that one as it is. I'm going to come down into our bevel here, and I want to come to our normal intensity. And so I'm going to expose this guy here. Again, normal intensity. And if I double click on our graph and come back down to our parameters, you can see that we're going to get normal intensity as our label, and our default will be a value of 5. So we also have a max value of 50. And so I just want to cover a little bit more in terms of what we can do with our parameters, because we've kind of glossed over it a little bit. So we all know that the default of this is 5 because that's what we actually set in our bevel node here. And we can change that in here to set whatever our new default is. We also have this min and this max value. So we can have a minimum amount that we want our intensity to be and a maximum amount. It's just a clamp for the min and max values that we can actually input into our intensity. So I'm going to want to make sure that we do indeed clamp this value so that we can't, go in and actually type something a little bit higher. And so I want our minimum value to be 1, right? Because I want to have some semblance of normal. But I think 50 is a little bit too high. And let's just set our default to 50 right now and see what that looks like. Right? And that's a little bit, friggin' ridiculous, right? Like that, what even is that? So I'm going to set our default back down to 5. And we can even just kind of play around with it, right? We can see, okay, what's going to look good. I'm just going to kind of bring my default up to a point where I think it starts to look a little too ridiculous. And right, so we're at 12 right now. And I think that's a little ridiculous. So maybe something like 7 as our max, right? So now you can see that I can only go between 1 and 7. And that's going to be the same thing when we get into our parent graph here, when we're playing around with the normal. it's only going to allow us to input either a value between 1 or 7. And I'm going to settle on a default of 5. And we can also play around with the step, right? Because you can see that as I drag this, we're getting, like 6.84, 4.21. And that's because our step value is at an increase of 0.01. If I make this something like 0.5 and I come into our parent graph here, because it's not going to work, unfortunately, in here, and I click on this panel guy here, you can see that I'm dragging it and we're going up and down by 0.5 of a value. So you can really fine tune the control that you want your user to have over this parameter to really make sure that it doesn't, break the material or the thing that you're working on here. So if I come back into our graph and I just double click to come back into our parameters here, I'm okay with really fine tuning it down to, we don't want to do 0. Make sure that it's 0.01. Otherwise, you're going to be sliding and nothing's going to be happening. And actually, it's kind of interesting that's even an option to go down to 0. I'm kind of curious as to what would happen, but for a different time. And lastly, these two values down here for our roughness are the final parameters that I wish to expose. So I'm going to select this node here and go to expose. And I'm going to want to call it just panel rough. And I'm going to expose this one here. Give it a new one. And we'll call this button rough. Make sure that it's okay. And then double click on our graph. And so now we've got these two roughness parameters down here. So I'm going to make sure that we label these appropriately, calling it panel roughness. And I want to add this to the roughness group, right? Because we want to keep our roughness parameters together, just a little bit more organization for us. And our button roughness, making sure to label that appropriately as well. And make sure to, again, spell roughness the same way I spelt it up here. Otherwise, we'll put it in two different groups. And that's looking pretty cool. So now if I come back to our panel option over here, you can see that we've got our metal color. So we can change that on the fly. I can find a different color. There we go. I'll go to gold here, right? We can change the normal intensity. And we can change the panel roughness and the roughness of the buttons. And so that's really handy because now we're not going to have to go back into this graph every time and, try and find all of the various different nodes that we have to go and, take a look at this parameter and that parameter. We can just go in our parent graph here, go into these parameters here, and just play around with them to update our material as we see necessary. All right, and so this tutorial might have been a little bit of a doozy for you, might have been a little bit boring, but it certainly was jam-packed with a lot of information. In this tutorial, we pretty much just honed our ability and our skills from previous tutorials in rapidly developing these materials to build upon our ultimate material for this mesh. And if you felt like this tutorial maybe went a little bit too fast, which probably by the time I'm done editing this, it's probably a long video, I urge you to just go back and really take a look at the beginning of this tutorial as well as the previous tutorials to get a little bit more comfortable with the idea of building a material graph and instancing this graph to basically bring our inputs through, build onto them a little bit, and then bring them back out to be used in future material graphs. So this tutorial is kind of the last tutorial that we're going to be doing a little bit of hand holding. And even though the content of the future tutorials isn't going to be changing at all, there's going to be a little bit less explanation for everything we're doing and a little bit more guidance as to the things we are doing that we don't have to necessarily dwell too much on. And this will be an opportunity for you as well to maybe deviate a little bit from the tutorial series and try out some different materials and some practices of your own that might fit your needs or suit your circumstance a little bit better than what I'm able to show you here. So in the next tutorial, we're going to take a look at building two of the largest and more central material graphs for this asset, being both the speaker and the body of the megaphone itself. And this is going to, again, just build on top of all of the different facets that we've been learning throughout making some of these smaller materials. So hopefully that's not scared you off and you're still hungry to learn. And I will see you in the next tutorial.